Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery, waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Hercule Poirot and Poirot's toughest case, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Hercule Poirot. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1: The Impossible Crime. The storm raged over Blackwood Manor, a relentless downpour hammering against the towering windows. Thunder growled in the distance, a deep and menacing sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. Inside, in the dim glow of a flickering chandelier, the body of Lord Henry Blackwood sat in his grand armchair, still, lifeless, frozen in an expression of sheer terror. The door was locked from the inside, the windows sealed shut. No footprints, no signs of struggle. And yet, he was dead. A murder that shouldn't be possible. The kind of case that defied all reason. Poirot stood motionless in the middle of the study, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the crime scene. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock. His instincts whispered to him, an uneasy feeling settling in his chest. Something was wrong. Something impossible. Mon Dieu, Poirot murmured under his breath, his voice barely audible over the storm. This is not just murder. This is theater. Downstairs, the air in the drawing room was thick with tension. A house full of secrets, of whispers unspoken, of alibis, paper thin. Lady Eleanor Blackwood sat stiffly in the corner, her hands trembling against her silk gown. She played the part of the grieving widow well, too well. Charles Sterling, the butler, hovered near the fireplace, his gaze fixed on the floor. He had seen something, Poirot could tell, but whatever it was, he was too afraid to speak. Isabella Vance, a family friend draped in black lace, sipped her wine with an unreadable expression. And then there was Dr. Rupert Graves, the family physician, whose fingers drummed nervously against the arm of his chair. Poirot's voice sliced through the tension like a knife. Each of you had a reason to want Lord Blackwood dead. But what I want to know is, how? No one answered. The silence stretched. The grandfather clock ticked. Someone shifted in their seat. The storm outside howled like a restless ghost. Then something caught Poirot's attention. Something so small, so seemingly insignificant, yet suddenly everything made sense. A painting, hanging slightly askew on the wall above the fireplace. His pulse quickened. Slowly, he stepped forward, his fingers grazing the edge of the gilded frame. The room held its breath as he lifted it from the wall, and behind it, cold, metallic, hidden in plain sight, was something that changed everything. His breath hitched. His mind raced. "My God," he whispered. And in that moment, Poirot knew. The killer was still in the room. Chapter 2: A Clue That Changes Everything. The rain hadn't stopped. It hammered against the windows of Blackwood Manor, the wind howling like an unseen spectre, rattling the old glass panes. Inside, the dim candlelight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. The storm was relentless, and so was the mystery. Poirot stood alone in the study, his sharp eyes scanning the crime scene once more. Lord Henry Blackwood's lifeless body still sat in that cursed armchair, his face frozen in an expression of terror. The locked room, the sealed windows, a murder without a weapon. It was a riddle, a puzzle with missing pieces, and Poirot hated puzzles without solutions. Something didn't fit. Something was wrong. A faint rustling behind him. Poirot turned sharply. Nothing. Just the heavy air of death clinging to the walls. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He needed to see what everyone else had missed. Downstairs, the drawing room was suffocating with silence. The suspects sat stiffly, eyes darting between each other. They all had something to hide, some more than others. Poirot stepped into the room, his presence demanding attention. He had studied their faces before, dissected their expressions, analyzed their lies, and yet there was something just out of reach. Then he saw it, a glint, a flicker, a detail so small, so insignificant, yet in that moment, everything shifted. A single drop of wax. It sat on the polished floor beneath the grand chandelier, barely visible unless you knew where to look. A mistake, a crack in a perfect crime. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He turned, gaze locking on to Lady Eleanor Blackwood, the grieving widow, the woman who had barely shed a tear. Her candle. It had been in her hands all evening, and yet the wax had fallen before the body was discovered. A slow, icy realization crept through Poirot's mind. "Lady Blackwood," he said softly, "tell me, at what point in the evening did your candle betray you?" Her fingers twitched, a sharp inhale. The others turned to look at her, suspicion thickening the air. The room shifted, the balance of power disturbed. She opened her mouth to speak, a denial, a lie, but before she could say a word, the doors slammed open. A scream. The butler, Charles Sterling, stumbled inside, his face pale as death. "The library," he gasped. "Someone else is dead." The storm outside roared louder. Poirot's pulse quickened. This was no longer just a locked room mystery. This was a game. And the killer was still playing. Chapter 3. The Witness Who Vanished. The storm had not relented. The wind screeched through the towering trees surrounding Blackwood Manor, the rain lashing against the stained glass windows like desperate hands trying to claw their way inside. The house stood like a monolith in the darkness, swallowing every whisper, every secret, every unspoken truth. And now, one of those truths had disappeared. Hercule Poirot stood at the threshold of the library, his sharp gaze fixed on the overturned chair, the broken teacup, the lingering scent of unease in the air. The only witness, the one person who had known the truth, was gone. Charles Sterling, the butler, had burst into the drawing room, his face ashen, his breath shallow with fear. "Mr. Avery, he's missing." A ripple of unease had passed through the remaining guests. Mr. Thomas Avery, the Blackwood family's solicitor, had sworn he had seen something the night Lord Blackwood died. He had promised to tell Poirot everything. And now he had vanished. The room had erupted. The widow, Lady Eleanor Blackwood, had gasped, pressing a delicate hand to her lips. The family friend, Isabella Vance, had narrowed her eyes, her grip tightening around her wineglass. Dr. Rupert Graves, ever the logical one, had muttered something about Avery getting drunk and wandering off into the storm. But Poirot knew better. People do not simply vanish, not like this, not when they are the key to unlocking a murder. Avery had been afraid. Poirot had seen it in his eyes. He had fidgeted with his ring, kept looking over his shoulder. He had asked Poirot to meet him in the library at exactly midnight, and now all that remained was the shattered teacup and the faint imprint of a body that had been dragged away. Poirot's voice sliced through the tension. This was no accident. A heavy silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, its glow casting shadows that stretched unnaturally along the bookshelves. The walls of the manor seemed to close in, suffocating, listening. Then, a whisper, almost imperceptible. He knew too much. All eyes turned to Isabella Vance. Her voice had been soft, but the words hung in the air like a death sentence. Poirot took a slow step forward. "And what, mademoiselle, did he know?" Isabella hesitated. A flicker of something passed over her face. Regret. Fear. Then, before she could speak, a scream. It came from beyond the hallway. High, piercing, desperate. Poirot ran. Through the dimly lit corridors, past the portraits of Blackwood ancestors whose painted eyes followed his every step. The scream had come from the cellar, a place long abandoned. He reached the heavy oak door. It groaned as he pushed it open. And there, on the cold stone floor, was Mr. Thomas Avery, or what was left of him. His hands were frozen mid-reach, his eyes wide, mouth open, in silent horror. A single bloody message had been scrawled onto the wall beside him. He saw too much. Poirot exhaled, his mind racing. This was no longer a game of deduction, no longer a matter of suspects and motives. This was a warning, and the killer was watching. Chapter 4. A murder with no killer. The rain had stopped. The air was thick, heavy with a silence that felt unnatural. Blackwood Manor stood in eerie stillness, as if the house itself had sensed something had shifted, something had broken. And then the body was found. Hercule Poirot stood over it, his keen eyes scanning every inch. No weapon, no visible wounds, no blood. The corpse of Isabella Vance lay cold in the center of the drawing room, her expression eerily peaceful, as if death had whispered something soothing before taking her. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no footprints leading in or out. The doors were locked, the windows sealed. She was dead, but no one could explain how. The others gathered in the room, a mixture of fear and disbelief settling over them like a thick fog. Lady Eleanor Blackwood, pale as a ghost, clutched her silk robe around herself, her breath shallow. Charles Sterling, the butler, stood frozen, his hands trembling. Dr. Rupert Graves checked her pulse, but his face told them all they needed to know. Poirot spoke at last, his voice calm. "There is no such thing as a murder without a murderer." His words cut through the silence. And yet, how could they explain this? The body was untouched. The doors had been locked from the inside. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, its chime echoing through the hollow corridors of the manor, a reminder that time was running out. And then, from the darkest corner of the room, a whisper. She wasn't supposed to die. All eyes turned. Charles Sterling. His lips had barely moved, but his words had slithered into the air, poisoning it. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "What do you mean, mon ami?" Sterling swallowed hard. "I mean, this wasn't how it was supposed to happen." The storm outside roared again, as if the sky itself had taken offense to his words. Poirot stepped closer. His mind was a machine, piecing together the puzzle. Isabella Vance, the woman who had known too much, the woman who had whispered about Mr. Avery before he died. But something still didn't make sense. No signs of struggle, no poison in her drink, no wounds, no weapon. Then Poirot saw it, a single shard of glass beneath her fingertips, barely visible, almost insignificant. He bent down, lifting it between two fingers. The light from the chandelier reflected off the surface. A mirror, a window, and then it struck him. The answer no one saw coming. He turned to the others, his voice slow, controlled. She wasn't killed by a person. She was killed by her own reflection. A breathless silence. Dr. Graves let out a short laugh, nervous, disbelieving. Poirot, that's impossible. What are you suggesting? Some supernatural nonsense? Poirot exhaled sharply. Not supernatural, psychological. He looked back at the glass shard, turning it in the light. The human mind is a dangerous thing, mon ami, a weapon sharper than any knife. He stood, facing them all. Isabella Vance was meant to witness a crime, not become a victim of one, but something or someone made her believe she would die tonight. A suggestion, a planted idea, a lie whispered enough times that the mind made it real. He turned to Lady Eleanor Blackwood. Her eyes widened. Are you suggesting that I... Poirot's gaze didn't waver. You told her, didn't you, that she was next, that there was no escape, that death would come for her, just as it had come for the others. The room tilted under the weight of his words. Poirot's voice lowered, deliberate and cold. And so it did. A choked sob escaped Lady Eleanor's lips. She hadn't laid a finger on Isabella. She hadn't needed to. She had planted the seed. The fear had done the rest. The mind had betrayed itself. A murder with no killer. The wind howled through the cracks of Blackwood Manor, rattling the glass in the windows. And for the first time, Poirot felt it. The presence of something deeper. Not ghosts, not fate, just the cruel weight of guilt. And in that moment, Lady Eleanor Blackwood began to laugh, softly, then louder, then hysterically, because the dead weren't the only ones trapped inside this house. Chapter 5. The Red Herring Trap. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of Blackwood Manor like the screams of ghosts trapped within the walls. The air inside was suffocating, thick with tension, as if the house itself had come alive, watching, waiting. Poirot stood in the darkened hallway, his breath steady, his mind whirring like a well-oiled machine. He had a lead, a single lead, and it felt like everything was finally falling into place. But something wasn't right. He had been played. The piece of paper had come to him through an anonymous note, passed under his door in the dead of night. A simple message. The truth lies in the cellar. The key is in the library. His instincts had told him to follow it. He had followed it, blindly, hoping it would lead him to answers. And so, he had. The library was quiet, its bookshelves towering, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into infinity. Poirot walked slowly, deliberately, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The smell of old leather and dust clung to the air. He paused, taking a deep breath, focusing on the subtle creak of the floorboards. He reached the desk. Papers scattered everywhere. A hidden drawer that had been pulled open. A key. It glinted in the faint light. He picked it up, heart racing. The cellar, he murmured to himself, his mind already racing ahead. This was it, the final piece. Poirot strode to the cellar door, his fingers tightening around the key. It would all make sense now. He could feel it in his bones. But when he opened the door, it was empty. No dead body, no clue, no nothing, just a cold, barren room with stone walls that seemed to close in on him. A red herring. He cursed under his breath. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. He wasn't just chasing shadows. Someone had carefully crafted this trap, led him to this point, only to reveal nothing. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway behind him. Poirot turned, every muscle in his body on alert. It was Lady Eleanor Blackwood. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She stepped into the cellar, looking past Poirot, her gaze lingering on the empty room. "What is it?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What have you found?" Poirot didn't answer. He felt the weight of the trap closing around him, suffocating him. "I've been misled," he said quietly, his voice low. "This was never meant to lead me to the truth." Lady Eleanor shifted, the air growing colder. The shadows around her seemed to grow deeper. For the first time, Poirot noticed her trembling hands, the way her lips quivered as she spoke. "You've been following the wrong clues, Poirot," she said softly. "But you're too clever to fall for the wrong one for long, aren't you?" Poirot froze, his mind flashing back to her earlier words. The hints, the deliberate misdirection, the subtle manipulation. A chilling thought rippled through his mind. He'd been played. The clues, they weren't meant for him. They were meant for someone else. But who? He took a step forward, his voice steady but laced with an edge of steel. "Why did you do it, Lady Eleanor? What was the real reason behind all this?" The room seemed to close in on them. The walls felt suffocating, the air thick with unspoken truths. Lady Eleanor's eyes shifted. For the first time, a smile tugged at the corner of her lips, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "There's more to this, Poirot. So much more." Her voice lowered, growing darker, almost seductive. "You've been chasing the wrong suspect for too long." Poirot's breath caught in his throat. The realization hit him like a hammer. It wasn't just the killer he had been hunting. It was the truth, carefully concealed beneath layers of lies. Then, without warning, Lady Eleanor stepped back into the shadows, her smile widening. And just like that, she was gone. Poirot stood motionless in the cold, dim cellar, the pieces of the puzzle slipping through his fingers. But he wasn't finished. The game had only just begun. The truth was closer than ever. But the killer was still one step ahead. Chapter 6. Secrets hidden in plain sight. The storm had finally passed. The air was cold and still, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for the truth. Poirot stood in the grand drawing room of Blackwood Manor, his eyes scanning the walls, the floor, the ceiling, every inch of the room. He had been here before, over and over. Each time, the puzzle seemed to get more tangled. But the truth had always been there, in plain sight. He had missed it, the tiny details, the overlooked clues, the little hints that were so obvious, yet had slipped past everyone's notice. Poirot's sharp eyes flickered to a small, unassuming painting hanging above the fireplace. A landscape. Beautiful, serene. At first glance, it was harmless. But now it seemed to be mocking him. He stepped closer, his fingers brushing against the frame. For the first time, he noticed a faint smudge in the corner of the painting, near the edge. With a quick motion, he removed the painting from the wall. Behind it, hidden within the dark recesses of the frame, was a small compartment. Inside, a single letter. He unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, frantic, someone in a hurry. "I've done what I had to do. I couldn't let it go on any longer. The truth will come out. If anyone is to blame, it's him. Don't trust anyone. Look to the past. Look to what's been hidden." Shh. Poirot's mind began to race. H. Who was H? The letter didn't make sense. It was as if someone had tried to confess, but had been silenced before they could finish. Poirot's gaze shifted to the rest of the room. The truth wasn't just here. It was everywhere. Lady Eleanor Blackwood had never left his thoughts. Her cold demeanor, her perfectly constructed alibi, the way she had slipped away into the shadows. She was hiding something, that much was clear. But what? Poirot's mind locked onto one detail. Something he had dismissed in the chaos of the last few days. The family portraits, the Blackwoods, had been rich, influential. But there was one person missing from every portrait. One name that never appeared in the family history. Poirot turned and strode across the room, his steps echoing in the silence. He reached for an old photograph album on the shelf. He flipped through it quickly, and then, there it was. A photograph of Lord Henry Blackwood, younger, standing with two women. One was Eleanor, the other, someone he had never seen before. A woman with striking features, a woman who looked far too familiar. Poirot's heart skipped. The woman in the photo was Isabella Vance. Everything clicked into place. Isabella wasn't just a family friend. She was family. Isabella had been the sister of Lord Henry Blackwood, the woman who had been erased from the family's past, the woman whose death had been the catalyst for all of this. But it didn't make sense. Why had she died? And why had she been erased? The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in around him. Poirot felt the weight of the truth pressing down on him. This was bigger than a simple murder. It was a family secret, a conspiracy. Eleanor had been trying to protect something. But what? A sudden movement caught his eye. A shadow. Poirot turned. Lady Eleanor Blackwood was standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. She had been watching him silently. Poirot didn't flinch. He wasn't surprised. She had always been close, always watching him, always controlling the narrative. "You've figured it out, haven't you?" she said, quietly, almost in a whisper. "You've been looking in the wrong places. The answers were never in the past. They were always in the present." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean, mademoiselle?" Lady Eleanor stepped into the room, her heels clicking on the floor. She moved with a grace that seemed almost unnatural. She stopped just inches away from him, her voice steady. "I killed Isabella." Poirot's breath caught in his throat. A slow, cold smile spread across Eleanor's lips. She was going to expose everything. The family secret, the truth about my father. Isabella was not just my sister. She was my mother's daughter. She was the illegitimate child of Henry Blackwood, the true heir to the Blackwood fortune. The words hit Poirot like a punch. Isabella wasn't just family. She was the real Blackwood heir. The inheritance had always been hers, and Eleanor had done everything to ensure she would never claim it. Eleanor's eyes darkened. "I couldn't let her ruin everything, so I made sure she was silenced." Poirot stood still, absorbing her words. The truth was darker than he could have ever imagined. The lies, the manipulations, the murders. It was all for money, for power. Eleanor's greed had driven her to kill, to destroy her sister, to bury the truth. But the truth had a way of coming to light. And now it was too late. Lady Eleanor's face crumbled. The mask of composure shattered, revealing the horror beneath. Poirot stared at her, his voice quiet but unyielding. "You may have hidden the truth, mademoiselle, but you could never erase it. Not from my eyes, not from anyone's eyes." She didn't respond. The room was silent. The walls, the air, the very space between them. It all felt suffocating. The truth had always been there. in plain sight. But sometimes it took the right eyes to see it. And now it was too late for her to run. Chapter 7. The Suspect That Makes No Sense. The storm had passed, but the air was thick, heavy with the kind of unease that clung to you, like a shadow you couldn't shake off. Inside Blackwood Manor, the silence was almost suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, felt like a warning. But Poirot knew. The truth was closer than ever. He could feel it. It was in the way the walls seemed to breathe, in the eyes of the suspects, in the whispered secrets that lingered, like ghosts. But there was one thing, one name, that kept creeping into his mind. And it made no sense. Charles Sterling. The butler. Why did the pieces keep pointing to him? The man who seemed so ordinary, so reliable, yet something wasn't right. Poirot walked slowly through the manor, his steps echoing in the empty halls. The suspects, all gathered like pawns in a game they didn't understand, still haunted his thoughts. Lady Eleanor Blackwood, the grieving sister with her polished, perfect facade. Dr. Rupert Graves, the ever-composed family physician, with his calm demeanor and vague answers. Isabella Vance's death had shattered everything, and yet there was still this nagging feeling, that one piece of the puzzle that Poirot couldn't shake. And then it hit him. The butler, Charles Sterling, the man who'd been there from the start. Quiet, observant, never a word out of place. He had no motive. Or did he? Poirot's gaze settled on the butler, who was nervously arranging the glasses in the drawing room, glancing up at Poirot as if trying to read his mind. The eyes were cold. Too cold. "Sterling," Poirot said, his voice calm but piercing. "Come with me." Charles Sterling didn't protest. He followed quietly, his expression unreadable. Poirot led him into a small study, the room dimly lit by a single desk lamp. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable, as though the truth was just waiting to escape. "I must ask you some questions, Sterling," Poirot said, his voice low but firm. "The death of Isabella Vance, and your involvement in it." The butler stiffened. "My involvement, sir?" He feigned surprise, but Poirot saw through it. He could feel the nervous energy emanating from him. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Yes, your involvement?" His gaze sharpened. "Tell me, Sterling, where were you when Isabella was found dead?" Charles Sterling hesitated. For a fleeting second, his eyes darted to the corner of the room, where a small candle flickered. Poirot caught it. That was the moment. He had seen it. The moment he realized he'd been played. "You've been in this house longer than anyone else," Poirot said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You have seen everything. But you, Sterling, you've been hiding in plain sight, just like the truth." The butler's eyes widened. "I don't—" Poirot raised a hand. "No more lies." He took a step closer. "Tell me, why did you kill her?" Sterling's face twisted with something between fear and disbelief. He stepped back, his voice trembling. I didn't. I didn't kill anyone." Poirot's gaze never left him. "Then why did you make the mistake of leaving this behind?" Poirot reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled letter. It was the one Sterling had tried so desperately to hide. A letter from Isabella Vance herself. The truth was all there, written in ink, smeared with fear. The letter detailed Sterling's affair with Isabella and how she had threatened to expose the secret, to reveal his lies to everyone. It had been a dangerous secret, one worth killing for. Sterling's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. He was cornered. The trap was set. I loved her, Sterling finally whispered, the confession escaping his lips like a whisper of smoke. But she was going to ruin everything. I couldn't let her do that to me. I couldn't let her tear my world apart. Poirot's heart tightened, but his voice remained steady. And so, you killed her. You made it look like she died of her own fears by using the one thing she never saw coming. You. The truth was ugly, dark, and yet it made perfect sense. The man who seemed so loyal, so humble, was the real killer, and all along, Poirot had seen the signs. But he hadn't believed them. He had dismissed it, too focused on the other suspects. The butler who had been in plain sight, the one who had been right under everyone's nose. Poirot's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the last piece of the puzzle fall into place. "You've been playing the game all along, Sterling," Poirot said, his eyes cold and unforgiving. "But now, the game is over." A long silence hung in the room. The truth had been revealed, and the murderer stood before him, broken, defeated, but still in disbelief. Poirot stepped back, his mind racing. This was the part no one had expected. The one person they had never thought to suspect, the butler, had been hiding in plain sight, manipulating them all. But now, it was done, and for the first time in his life, Poirot allowed himself to breathe. The case was solved, and the truth, no matter how hidden, always found a way to surface. The camera lingers for a moment on Sterling's broken face before cutting to the empty halls of Blackwood Manor, where the echoes of the past still linger. The storm may have passed, but the shadows remain, and with them, the cold truth. Chapter 8. A twist. Even Poirot didn't see coming. The storm was over, but the storm inside Blackwood Manor had just begun. Poirot stood in the dimly lit hallway, his hand resting lightly on the door to the study. The case was solved, or so he thought. Charles Sterling, the butler, guilty. The truth had come to light, and Poirot could finally breathe a sigh of relief. He had solved it. He had uncovered the lies, exposed the murderer. But something didn't sit right. He felt it. The nagging feeling at the back of his mind, the one that whispered there was more to this than met the eye, the one that made his chest tighten with unease. Poirot's fingers gripped the door handle. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like the walls of Blackwood Manor were closing in, trying to trap him in their secrets. He pushed the door open slowly. Inside, Lady Eleanor Blackwood stood by the window, staring out into the quiet night. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the moon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch, reaching toward her. Poirot closed the door softly behind him. "Mademoiselle, we have solved the case." His voice was calm, but his eyes never left her. She didn't turn around. Instead, she whispered softly, almost as if to herself, "The game was never about the butler, Hercule." Poirot froze. Her words hit him like a slap. The butler, the one who had seemed so obvious, the one he had dismissed as too plain to be the mastermind. How could it not be him? Lady Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes filled with a strange, unreadable calm. "You've been looking in all the wrong places." Poirot's heart pounded in his chest. What was she saying? "There's someone else," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. "Someone who was always there. Someone you never suspected." Poirot felt the ground shift beneath him. This wasn't right. This wasn't the way it was supposed to be. "Who?" His voice came out in a rasp, barely controlled. Lady Eleanor's lips curled into a smile. "Someone who had been with us all along. someone you'd never think could be capable of murder. Suddenly, the door behind Poirot creaked open. He spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his pocket. It was Dr. Rupert Graves, the family physician. But Poirot's eyes quickly narrowed. There was no fear in the man's eyes, no hesitation, only an eerie calm. Poirot's breath hitched. This didn't make sense. "You," Poirot finally said, his voice trembling with disbelief. "You were the one." Dr. Graves stepped into the room, a slow, deliberate movement, and closed the door behind him. He looked at Poirot and then back to Lady Eleanor. His expression was one of absolute calm, like a man who had been waiting for this moment. "Yes, Poirot," Graves said, his voice smooth, almost comforting. "I'm the one who has been playing this game with you, you and your precious little deductions. But I always knew better." Poirot's mind raced. Dr. Graves had been the steady hand. Through all of this, the calm and rational presence, always looking after the Blackwood family's health. He had been so blameless in the eyes of everyone. But Poirot now realized his calm demeanor had always been a mask. "You were never just a doctor, were you?" Poirot asked, his voice growing colder. Graves smiled. "No, Poirot, I wasn't just a doctor. I was the architect of this entire mess, and I couldn't let it go on any longer." Poirot took a step forward. "But why? What was your motive? What could you possibly have to gain from all of this?" Graves's smile widened. "You still don't get it, do you? It wasn't about money, power, or revenge." His eyes gleamed with something darker. "It was about control, about eliminating the one thing that threatened everything I've worked for, the one thing that would have ruined my plans." Poirot's blood ran cold. He suddenly realized the horrible truth. "You were trying to protect yourself," Poirot whispered. Dr. Graves nodded slowly. "That's right. I wasn't just the family physician. I was their father's illegitimate son." The words hit Poirot like a thunderclap. The truth was so simple, so twisted, that it barely seemed to register. Graves wasn't just a doctor, he was a blood relative, a son of the Blackwood patriarch, who had been hidden in plain sight for years. The entire family, including Lady Eleanor, had been blind to the fact that he was the one who stood to inherit the family fortune. The one person who had everything to lose. Poirot stepped back, trying to process the enormity of it. "You murdered Isabella, didn't you? Because she knew the truth. She knew you were the real heir. You killed her to keep your secret safe." Graves's expression faltered, but only for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Isabella knew too much. She was going to expose everything, and I couldn't have that." Poirot's mind spun. It all made sense now. The hidden letters, the vague explanations, the carefully planted red herrings. Everything had pointed to someone else. Everyone had been so focused on Sterling, on the obvious suspects, that they had never thought to look at the one person who had the most to lose, the one person who had been right there all along. "But what about Lady Eleanor?" Poirot asked, his voice shaking. Lady Eleanor's face was unreadable. She stepped closer to Graves. "I knew the truth all along, Poirot. I knew who he was, but he promised me that no one would find out, that I wouldn't lose everything." Poirot's heart sank. The family was never what it seemed. The truth had always been hidden in plain sight, in the shadows of the manor. "You were willing to sacrifice everyone for your own gain," Poirot said, his voice cold with disgust. "All of this. For control." Dr. Graves didn't flinch. His expression remained as calm as ever. "I didn't have a choice. It was the only way to keep it all in my hands. Poirot's eyes narrowed. This was the twist that had been waiting for him, the one that no one could have seen coming. The murderer wasn't someone on the outside, wasn't some random criminal. It was someone who had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. The real heir, the real killer, Dr. Rupert Graves. The silence in the room was suffocating. Every piece of the puzzle had come together, and yet the weight of it felt like a crushing burden. Poirot stepped back, his mind racing. The game had changed. The truth had shifted beneath his feet. And now, the only thing left to do was to reveal it to the world. But this truth, no one would ever be prepared for. Chapter 9. The Truth Hiding in the Shadows. The clock struck midnight. Inside Blackwood Manor, a heavy silence descended. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, clawing toward the light like the secrets that had been buried here for far too long. The storm outside had subsided, but the storm inside, the one that had been raging for days, was only just beginning. Hercule Poirot stood alone, staring at the floor of the drawing room, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Every single piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Every lie, every deception, every betrayal. He had followed the clues, analyzed the suspects, and uncovered the killers. Or so he thought. But what if he had missed something? What if the truth was still hiding in the shadows? Poirot's gaze shifted to the shadows in the room. He had solved this case over and over in his mind, but there was something that had always felt off, something he had overlooked. And now, as the final pieces began to fall into place, the chilling realization crept in. He had been so focused on the obvious suspects, the butler, the grieving widow, even the hidden family secrets, that he had failed to see the most dangerous player of all. Poirot's breath quickened. He turned on his heel and walked to the center of the room, stopping before the fireplace, where a single portrait hung on the wall. A simple portrait, but now, in this moment, it seemed to pulse with secrets. The truth was hiding there all along, hidden in the shadows of this very house. The portrait was of Lord Henry Blackwood, the patriarch of the family, standing tall and proud. But in the far corner, partially obscured, was a figure, someone he had not noticed before. A shadow, lurking, out of place in this otherwise serene portrait. Poirot's heart skipped. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing as he examined the figure. The figure was too familiar. It was the family physician, Dr. Rupert Graves, standing there, hidden, barely visible in the corner of the frame. Suddenly, it clicked. Everything he had pieced together, all the lies, all the carefully constructed alibis, they had led him in the wrong direction. Poirot turned sharply to face the room. His mind raced. He had followed the obvious trail. Charles Sterling, the butler, had seemed like the most likely suspect. But the truth was never as simple as that. It had always been right under his nose. Dr. Graves had been there all along, standing in the shadows. He had been part of the family, not just a physician, not just a man with medical knowledge, but a man with secrets. Graves wasn't just a murderer. He had been the one manipulating everything from the start. Poirot's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the tension in the room like a blade. I see it now. You were always there, weren't you? Watching, waiting, always in the background. The true heir. Graves's eyes darkened. His lips twitched into a twisted smile. You were never going to see it, Poirot. The truth was too well hidden. You were chasing shadows. You were always chasing shadows. Poirot's blood ran cold. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. You weren't just hiding in plain sight. You were in control the entire time. You made sure I followed the wrong trail. Graves took a slow step forward. Isn't that how it always works, Poirot? The truth hides in plain sight. The best lies are the ones everyone believes, the ones they never question. Poirot's voice grew louder, his anger rising. But the truth always comes to light. No matter how much you hide it, it always finds a way to break free. Graves laughed softly, shaking his head. Oh, Poirot, you've been playing in my game all along. Every twist, every turn, every false lead, it was all designed to bring you here, to this moment. But by the time you realized it, it was already too late. Poirot took a step back, his mind racing. Too late? What do you mean, too late? Graves smiled, a cruel, cold smile that chilled Poirot to the bone. You think you've solved everything, Poirot. You think you've cracked the case. But you haven't. Not yet. Poirot's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? The room seemed to close in around them. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the walls like they were alive. Dr. Graves stepped forward again, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. You're too late, Poirot. Lady Eleanor already knows. She's already taken care of things. Poirot's heart skipped a beat. What are you saying? What have you done? The door slammed open behind Poirot, and Lady Eleanor walked into the room, her face pale, her eyes empty. She stepped toward Graves, her footsteps deliberate, as if they had planned this moment together. Poirot's eyes flicked between them. He couldn't believe it. He had been so sure, so certain. But this was a twist he hadn't seen coming. Lady Eleanor stood beside Dr. Graves, her voice soft, almost too calm. The game was never about who killed Isabella. It was about who would survive, who would inherit everything. And now, we're the ones who hold the power. Poirot's world shattered. You're both part of it? All this time, you've been playing me? Graves nodded slowly. You were never supposed to figure it out. You were never supposed to see the truth. And now, he paused, a glimmer of something dark flickering in his eyes. Now, it's too late. The truth is buried. Lady Eleanor stepped closer to Poirot, her expression unreadable. There's no need to chase shadows anymore, Poirot. The truth is dead, and so are you. Poirot's blood ran cold. The realization hit him like a wave. Everything had been part of their plan. They had manipulated him, played him like a pawn in their twisted game. And now it was too late to stop them. The room spun as Poirot's mind raced. The truth had been hidden in the shadows, and now the shadows had consumed everything. The game had changed, and the truth, the one he had spent so long uncovering, was lost forever. The camera fades to black. The echoes of Poirot's final words linger in the silence. It was always too late, wasn't it? Chapter 10. Poirot's final move. The storm had returned. It battered against the windows of Blackwood Manor, its howling winds shaking the house to its core. But inside, the air was still, suffocating. The final move was about to be made. Poirot stood alone in the center of the dimly lit study, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The game had changed. The lies, the betrayals, the twists, it had all led to this moment. His mind raced, his sharp eyes scanning the room one last time. Every detail, every clue, every misstep. But this time, there was no more guessing, no more false leads. He had the truth. And this was the last revelation. The suspects were gathered in front of him. Lady Eleanor Blackwood, the grieving widow, her face pale but composed. Dr. Rupert Graves, the quiet, cold family physician who had turned out to be the true heir. And Charles Sterling, the butler, who had been involved in far more than just serving drinks. They were all here, standing before him, like puppets, waiting for their strings to be cut. Poirot's gaze locked on each of them, his voice low, his words carrying the weight of every piece of this intricate puzzle. "You've all had your part in this," Poirot began, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "But the truth—" He paused, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "The truth is far darker than you could have ever imagined." Lady Eleanor took a step forward, her eyes narrowing. "Enough, Poirot. We know you've solved it. You've found the killer. Now, what are you waiting for?" Poirot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a single piece of paper. A letter. The one that had started it all. The one that no one had thought to question. The one that had been hidden in plain sight. This letter, Poirot said, holding it up for them to see, was the key. The truth was here all along, but it was buried beneath your lies. The letter was a confession from Isabella Vance, the woman who had died, the one who had been erased from history. In it, she wrote about the family's darkest secrets, the inheritance, and the true heir, the one who had orchestrated it all. Poirot's voice grew softer, more calculated. "You all believed the truth was buried, but I knew it was right here, this entire time." Dr. Graves stepped forward, his face betraying the first signs of unease. "What are you trying to say, Poirot?" Poirot's smile faded. His gaze hardened, and his voice became steely. "I'm saying you're all looking in the wrong direction. You've been playing this game for so long, you didn't see what was right in front of you. The killer is one of you." There was a long pause. The silence was so thick it could suffocate a person. Then, the bombshell. Poirot turned to Charles Sterling, the butler. "Sterling, you were never just a servant, were you? You were part of the scheme all along. You helped Graves manipulate everyone, helped him cover up the truth. But in the end, you made one fatal mistake." Sterling's face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked like a deer caught in headlights, his world falling apart. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "You thought you were a part of the game, but you were just another pawn. You never knew the full extent of what was going on. The killer was always one step ahead of you." The shock was palpable in the room. Everyone was staring at Sterling, but Poirot's gaze never wavered from Lady Eleanor. Her eyes widened with fear. She took a step back, her breath coming quicker now. "What are you saying, Poirot?" Poirot's voice was steady, unyielding. "The one who orchestrated everything, the one who manipulated you all, the one who pulled the strings, was never Graves. It was you, Lady Eleanor. You." A gasp rang out from the others. Eleanor looked as though the breath had been knocked out of her. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. Poirot stepped closer to her, his voice lowering, now laced with ice. "You were the one who convinced everyone that the inheritance was yours. You manipulated your brother's death. You had everything to lose if the truth came out. So, you destroyed it all. You killed Isabella." Lady Eleanor stumbled back, shaking her head. "No, I didn't. I couldn't." Poirot raised a hand, silencing her. "But you did, Eleanor. You made sure the truth was buried. You turned your own family against each other, and when Isabella threatened to expose the Truth, you made sure she was silenced. She took a shaky breath, looking to Dr. Graves for help, but he stepped back, his face cold and expressionless. Poirot turned to face Graves. You, Doctor. Graves were nothing more than a pawn in her game. You thought you were the heir. You thought you were the one pulling the strings. But in reality, you were her puppet, and she had you right where she wanted you. Graves' eyes flickered with something dark, but he said nothing. Poirot's voice grew louder, more commanding. And you, Sterling, the butler, you were the one who helped to cover up her tracks. You made sure no one suspected her. You played the part of the loyal servant, but in truth, you were just a tool in her hands. The room fell into silence once again, the weight of Poirot's words settling like a heavy fog. Poirot stood in front of them, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes sharp and focused. The truth was always there, hiding in plain sight. And now, it is time for you to face it. There was a long pause, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Lady Eleanor's face crumbled, her eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't. Poirot shook his head slowly. The truth is never as simple as we want it to be, but it's always there, waiting for the right eyes to see it. The shock in the room was deafening. The weight of Poirot's revelation hit like a tidal wave. No one had seen it coming. No one had expected the widow, the one who seemed the most innocent, the one who had grieved, to be the mastermind behind it all. Lady Eleanor fell to her knees, her shoulders shaking as the truth crushed her. Her life, her lies, had unraveled before her. Poirot turned and walked slowly toward the door. Justice will be served, but some truths are too painful to bear. The camera lingers on Lady Eleanor, her face a picture of devastation, as Poirot steps into the shadows, leaving the final puzzle piece in place. The truth is never what it seems, and sometimes it's already too late.